Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Teddy Chad, and I am part of the ACE Emerging Professionals London and South East Committee. First of all, welcome to this ACE Emerging Professionals webinar. It's been organised by the London and the South East Committee, and today we're exploring the issue of why infrastructure is ignoring technology. We've got a really good lineup and of panelists. We've got Gary Raccuja from Highways England, Yuvraj Domun from Amey Consulting, Dr. Eime Tobari from Co-Creative, and Emily Scoones of Ramboll. The plan is for each of the speakers to present for 5 minutes, to allow them to introduce themselves and to talk a little bit about why technologies don't always land in infrastructure. Then we'll move on to a panel discussion. This discussion is very much for each of you, and I encourage all of you to be asking questions throughout. So a bit of housekeeping first, if that's okay. Repeat listeners will know a lot about this already, but it's just good to remind everyone. This webinar is going to be best experienced through headphones, which will help to cut out background noise. And if you do want to ask questions, and please do throughout, then go to the questions in your control panel, and all of those will be anonymous if you'd like them to be. You don't have to wait until the QA session to ask your question. Send them as we go through presentations, and we'll try and answer as many as possible. But if we don't and you would like them answered, then we'll get back to them after the webinar itself. And just to let you know, we will be recording this webinar and we will upload it to our website in the next few days. Thank you. I think first we're going to move to a poll. Oh, well, not, that's a good point. So I'd like to hand over to the outgoing committee chair of London and the South East Committee, and also to Wojciech, who is the new incoming chair, to just explain a little bit about the ACE and what we're up to.
Hello there, yes, so I'm Annabelle Lowy, and I am the outgoing chair of this region's Emerging Professional Committee. And I just wanted to come on to say a word to say that the last 2 years have been very enjoyable, and thank you to everyone for their support, not only on the committee, but our very valued attendees. We certainly got off to a cracking start with many in-person events happening, and I've had to transition, as everyone has, to a virtual world in the last 12 months or so. That said, we've still maintained sort of a successful period of having multiple webinars. We've also got blogs coming on the way, and we're always looking for new innovative ideas and new committee members to join along with Wojciech, who's going to be taking on the role of chair. And just a quick thank you to Teddy Chad, who is your chair today, but has been the vice chair of the group for the last 2 years, and Nikita Kumar, who's also been taking on the role of vice chair. And just to say, it's been a pleasure, and I'm sure it'll be really exciting times ahead with Wojciech. So if you'd like to say some words about the upcoming role of the group, then please do.
Hello, everyone. My name is Wojciech Szewczak, and I'm honored to take over the reins from Annabelle and to lead the committee of the next generation of consultants and engineers based in London and the Southeast region. So on committee's agenda for this year is to focus on achieving net zero, diversity and inclusion in the workplace, and future skills and capabilities of emerging professionals. There are upcoming events in the calendar, which I wanted to share with you. First one is on sustainable housing provision, a case for the vertical extension of existing buildings, which is happening on 16th of February. And there is another exciting event coming up, which is 3,650 days, the decade of change, how we are going to achieve net zero ambitions. So this event will happen in March, and you will hear more about it on our social media shortly. So if you are based in London and the Southeast region and you want to join our committee with some fantastic ideas or topics you just want to share with other emerging professionals, please contact me directly. Over to you, Teddy.
Fantastic, thank you guys. Yeah, we've got some really good stuff coming up, but today we're going to talk about technology and infrastructure. And first off, we want to find out a little bit about you. So there should be a poll coming around with a couple of questions. They're just trying to identify what do you do, where do you work, what kind of sectors are you in? And I realize this isn't going to cover every space, so please try and, if it doesn't work for you, then use other, but if you do fit into one of those categories, then do let us know. Thank you. I think we'll give about 30 seconds for each of the questions. So predominantly, we're seeing the majority of people here from an engineering and quite a lot from other as well. Government and public sectors, less represented. So it's really interesting, and that's kind of good to allow us to slightly change and tweak our presentations for those who are the panelists as well. Thank you. Thank you all very much. The results of that show that the 40% of those dialing in work in transport, which is really interesting, with a little bit in commercial and residential, a few in energy and communications, but no representations from utilities or healthcare. And we've got 3 people from other as well, so a little bit covered down there. But it's interesting that there's a lot of transport in the meeting today. So, right, what's next? I'm going to hand over to our first speakers. Now, Yuvraj and Gary come as a double act, so we've given them a few minutes to introduce themselves and to talk a little bit about why they think technology and infrastructure don't always work together. So I'll hand over to them. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Gary Raccuja. I am a philosopher turned engineer and most recently data scientist. I'm an infrastructure nerd and I'm very passionate about innovation. As I've joined Highways England 2 days ago, actually, and having been a consultant with them for 5 years before that, in this new role, it is very important that I say, as you might expect, that any views expressed here are my own and do not necessarily represent those of Highways England.
Hello, hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yuvraj Domun. I'm a data scientist at Amey Consulting, and I love everything data. And I'm a data science enthusiast, so wherever I can, I try to promote the use of data science. And I'll pass on now to Gary again for the rest of the presentation.
Thank you. So, can we move to the next slide, please? Excellent. So James Watt taught us how to harness steam in Industry 1.0, as you all know, I'm sure, engineers. Thomas Edison gave us the light bulb. And if steam is Industry 1.0 and electricity is Industry 2.0, then my metaphor for Industry 3.0 is Excel spreadsheets. Did you know that approximately 80% of the world's business knowledge is stored in Excel? Teddy might be very pleased about that, but Excel has limitations, as I'm sure we all remember, the Health Secretary has painfully discovered around November time that there's only a certain number of rows in there, in that table. Which brings me to Industry 4.0, for which my analogy is Python, a coding language that is all around strong and particularly good at visualizing data. So my view is that Industry 4.0 will be the age where many of us will be able to better communicate with machines directly and leverage their power to understand the world through data. Next slide, please. So often when we speak with stakeholders in infrastructure organizations, there's a sentiment that most of the value comes from automation, just reducing manual work. I don't agree with that. I think the majority of the value actually comes through improved decision making that comes with understanding actual data. And we can pick this up, I think, in a conversation. It's a very interesting point. But I'll hand over to you, Yuvraj, to talk about what the data science value chain is.
Yes, thank you, Gary. If we move to the next slide, please. So yes, when Gary mentioned about an organization having a lot of data, and where do we start to unlock the value within the data? So we have the data science value chain here, which essentially tells us there are 3 steps we can take in succession to start unlocking that value. So the first step we take is we describe the data. So we try to learn more about the data that we have. And on the next slide, we talk about predictive analytics. So we have data. This is where we start extracting knowledge and rules from the data to build systems that we can use to make better decisions. And then on the next slide, we talk about prescriptive analytics. So this is where in the data science value chain, we start using cognitive services that is available out there for cloud platforms, for example, to automate decision-making process. This can be through computer visions or simple optimizations of path, for example. And then if we move to the next slide, I'll pass this to Gary.
Excellent. So the second part, we want to briefly touch on what are the risks to data science projects, and just have a think in your mind very briefly about what percentage of data science projects you believe are successful. And this, I think, is at the very heart of why infrastructure is ignoring tech. And let's move to the answer. As I'm sure many of you might have heard, 85% of these kinds of projects are unsuccessful. But the reason we're here is to understand what can we do about it. And on the next slide, we'll see a study done by Becker in the same year that actually tries to uncover the causes. And if we look at the top 6 on this chart, they can be grouped into 3 familiar categories of people, business, and technology. So if we move to the next slide, and the one after, then Yuvraj will tell us more. We would like to explore each of those themes, like people, business, and technology, in the conversation further. We've got some stories of our own in this space, but we'd like to hear. So we want to make a proposal in terms of what could be a solution in each of those areas, and then open it up later.
Thanks, Gary. So the question today is, why is infrastructure ignoring tech? And we talked briefly about some of the causes that might lead to failure. And one solution to that is we can start addressing those causes to essentially give tech a better chance, especially in data science, to give data science technology a better chance of making it through to production, as we like to call it. So there are 3 things we focus on. We can focus on as organizations. So the first one is focusing on people. So here we say engineers, the domain experts are an integral part of any technology or digital transformation that we try to implement as an organization, because they are the one who understands the data. And the second point we try to make here is about business. So whatever technology we use, it is very clear. It's very important to have clear business objectives to try to really align with the vision of the companies that we're working for. And then the third one is technology, as we all know, is evolving at a very fast pace. And one way to be successful is to make sure that as technology enthusiasts, we keep up to speed with what is happening and invest in innovation. So these are the key points. And then collaboration and innovation is key to making sure we limit or maximizes the chance of technology being adopted. So I'd like to thank you all for your time and attention to this slide. And then now I'll pass back to Teddy to remember the rest of the slides.
Yuvraj, Gary, thank you very much. That was really interesting, and I hope sparked a few questions in our attendees' heads. Next to speak is Emily Scoones, a computational design engineer from Ramboll. So I'll hand over to her.
Thanks, Teddy. So I actually started from a structural engineering background, and I've been working throughout my career developing sort of internal digital tools for people to use and develop. And now I'm part of a team that is helping to bring a generative design software, so a new technology, both to the business as a sort of tech startup, but also hopefully to the industry. And if you go to the next slide, please. So on the screen here, you can see a typical kind of adoption curve for technology. And as we know, there's loads of amazing technologies out there, everything from drones through to BIM. And some of those have had more success in that taking that adoption curve than others. So BIM has maybe got a little bit further up that curve. Things such as data analytics is definitely on the up. Also things like robotics are definitely maybe more in the innovator stage, and various other kinds of technology have gone maybe partially up that adoption stage and then gone back down again. And the question is, why is infrastructure and the construction industry allowing that to happen? And there's a whole swathe of different reasons, and some of them have been touched upon already. Everything from, how do we deal with procurement routes with innovative projects and new technology, to risk appetite. But there's a few that I would like to just try and highlight today, which I've found really important and that I've learned a lot through my own personal journey. So next slide, please. So the first one is whether we're asking the right questions to ensure that we're developing or using technology in a way that's both useful and repeatable. So as I said, I've been part of this tech startup to bring up these tools. And throughout this journey, I've heard so many stories of people developing tools or new products or anything and bringing them to market just to have clients or even people internally within their business saying, I won't buy that, or I don't need that. That's not solving a problem that I have. And that's something that we've really learned on our journey, is that when we first started creating this software, we were developing the features and the roadmap based off what we knew of the construction industry. And that gets you a certain way. I don't take any credit away from people's own knowledge, but you build in your own biases and your own understandings into what you're developing. And as part of an innovation accelerator bootcamp that we then went on, we learned about really putting the client at the center and really understanding their problems by running tests where you make them rank your features that they want, or you go to them not speaking about your product, but trying to really understand the problems that are at the heart of their business to make sure that you are developing a product or a solve or using technology in a way that's actually useful to them. And this is something that definitely shouldn't just happen at the beginning when you're first fledgling an idea, but something that should be happening regularly. And something that I found, I don't know with you other engineers, is that we can be a bit perfectionist, that we want to develop tools until they're completely beautiful, they work properly. But the risk of that is that you again go down that rabbit hole of developing something that isn't actually solving the client's problems, or you take it in a way that actually that doesn't quite work for them. And so being able to say, I've got this sort of partially finished product, what is your thoughts on it? And really involving clients or the people that you're trying to solve the problems for within that process is something that's really important, so that you kind of develop something that's actually, that people will pay for and people will use and want to adopt. And if you go on to the next slide, please. And part of that journey is that as you start to scale, because often with a lot of these projects, they start off small, maybe on a particular project or on, for a particular client, is understanding that the adoption of this technology does require a large amount of investment, no matter whether it's internally or if you're externally trying to create some new innovative offering, or even just if you're developing a little piece of tech on a specific job. That at the beginning, you have to invest quite a lot of money or time or data into understanding what the problem is, developing the infrastructure around it, potentially even developing a tool, which is a fundamental shift from sort of traditional consultancy in infrastructure consultancy workflows where, you know, as you go through a project, you develop a little bit more, you gain a little bit more ideas, and you're constantly just kind of delivering on your scope. And so that's a fundamental shift in mindset of actually not trying to prioritize the short-term revenue, but to develop with scale and actually get a technology to adopt. You need to understand what the problem you're trying to solve and whether it's applicable over a wider range of projects and not the project specifics that are in front of you. And so making sure that that's programmed into the way that you project manage, you just speak with your clients, are two sort of key things in order to make sure that you're developing things that can be adopted and repeatedly adopted and used, whether it be internal tools of digitization or external offerings. So that's just a sort of couple of ideas of the many, many reasons, but two that I've really, really sort of learned about in my own career. So those two being, you know, really understanding your client and changing your mind shift into how a project should be delivered. And I look forward to discussing this in a little bit more detail later. Back to you, Teddy.
Emily, thank you very much. It's really interesting to hear. And certainly for me, perfection was a word that you used, which I think is really interesting. Perfection isn't always something that we can guarantee in technology, but we do see in engineering, and maybe we shouldn't always be driving for that. I'll hand over to our last panelist, Dr. Eime Tobari, founder of Co-Creative, and I'd ask her to introduce herself and tell us about what her experiences have been. Thank you.
Thank you, Teddy. Yes, so my name is Eime Tobari. I'm social value strategist and urban analytics expert. So I'd like to, I feel like I'm massively underprepared compared to the other panelists. I don't have any slides, but I thought it might be useful to just kind of introduce myself, my experience, and leading on to my perspectives and on issues around the topic. So first of all, so my background is in sociology and architecture. And I worked in a consultancy, small consultancy in planning and design, which focused on using data analytics in the planning and design of architecture and cities. And then I moved on to AECOM. I think someone mentioned the large dominant consultancy business. It might be one of those. So I was a director of urban analytics. And so my mission was to kind of promote the use of data in planning and design, but across the business line. So I was part of the planning team, but my mission was to actually work with the transport and infrastructure and environment teams to really generally kind of promote digital transformation. So I was brought into this corporate kind of team, which was promoting the digital or driving a digital transformation. And then there was also kind of an effort to do something about smart cities. So I was also kind of informally part of the kind of driver for the smart city kind of offer and the network within the company. And then while I was there was also a movement or an effort to create a data science center of excellence in the company, across all these geographies. AECOM is a global business, so including the States and APEC, and as well as Europe. So I became EMEA lead of this data science center of excellence. So my experience is at predominantly at the managerial level, but that kind of gave me an exposure to the industry, the issues relating to the industry and corporate in terms of culture and structure. So, for example, one of the things that I came across was that there was a corporate interest, and it was in technology and data, and that was definitely part of the focus at the board level. But I think there was a gap between that corporate will and the reality, and it didn't really kind of cascade it down to actionable plans. And perhaps we can, I'm sure, with the other panelists, that we can talk more about it. Another thing was, I'll just kind of keep to the highlight. Another thing is the risk. I think the couple of panelists mentioned as well, and the risk in the business, especially in the corporate business, is a very difficult thing to handle. And I think in general, there's a lack of R&D investment, and so kind of cost for failure is not accounted in the corporate business model. And I was talking to a friend of mine who works in the pharmaceuticals, and then she was saying, oh, that's very strange, because, you know, in pharmaceuticals, it's all about innovation and R&D. And so I think there is a kind of industry, the culture in the industry, that probably kind of related to the engineering, you know, as Teddy mentioned, that the engineering having to kind of thrive for perfection. And yes, but I think the innovation needs a failure, and that's not being accounted in the business model is also one of the major issues. And that's across the industry, in the client and in the project context, the failure is not really accounted, and that kind of goes against innovation. So yes, I think there are more kind of details that I can provide, but perhaps it's more useful to open up to all the discussion with everyone, with the other panelists, to discuss more further in detail.
Amy, thank you very much. Really interesting. And as you say, I think we'll open this up to a panel discussion. So if I could ask the panelists to put their cameras back on. And I would encourage all the attendees to add and write some questions, whether that's something based on something you've heard today or something that's completely unrelated, to ask, and I'll try and get through as many as possible. The first thing I wanted to ask to probably Gary and Amy is about cost of failure. So failure is probably inevitable in data science, and I think it's required. One could say if we're not failing, we're not really innovating. How do we communicate that to infrastructure organizations so that it is seen as acceptable and it is factored into business plans? I'll probably go to Amy first.
Sorry. Yeah. Well, that's a very good question, and yes, I don't have a straight answer to that, to be honest. But it's really I think the corporate, at the high level, it needs to be understood that it's more the risk of not innovating. And that is not understood. So it's only regarded as cost, but actually what's the cost of not doing it? And that's very difficult to obviously quantify. but some people have instinct. But we really need, the board level understanding of that cost, that you would become irrelevant. You would become outdated, but it will probably take 10 years for especially like a big corporates to be outdated, because the industry doesn't move that fast. So there are still things that you can do with, like how you used to do, but that will run out. So yes, I think that's acknowledgement.
I think that's an excellent point.
Sorry, I was just going to say that yeah, I'll hand over to you in a second, but there's an analogy that I heard a few years ago, which said, oh my God, why are we spending so much money training up our staff? They're not doing anything productive and it's costing us loads. In 5 years' time, we're going to lose so much money. And the response to that is, in 5 years' time, if we haven't spent any money on training, where are we going to be? And I think it's probably quite a good analogy. If we don't innovate, what's the risk? And that's potentially the way we should be looking at it. Gary, what do you think?
I think anyway, it's a spot on challenge, which is baked in inertia into any organization of not doing anything, right? There is that, like, which is a decision, no matter how you view it. If there is an issue and a risk that needs addressing, you not addressing it is a decision. But I guess it is, it is much less risky to stick your head above the parapet and try something that may not be the right approach. So I think it's fair to say that I can't tell you right now what my experience in a public sector organization will be, but maybe in a couple of months I will be able to tell you more of what, how does a public sector organization view failure. I don't have a problem with failure, because I am, maybe because just I am a fairly optimistic person by nature. I see that, I very much resonate with the famous quote of that a failure is one way in which we should not do a thing, but as soon as we've learned that message and sort of find another way in which we can do that thing, or realize actually that thing we cannot do it just yet, and so we'll address it later. I think that's fine in itself.
Thank you, Gary. That's a really good point. I'm going to move to a question that was asked in the chat around the dominant consultancy business model. And this was asked, the direct words were, any thoughts on the impact of the dominant consultancy business model on the ability to embrace tech? So the way I read that is a discussion around how we sell ourselves. Are we selling our time, or are we selling value? And I think, Emily, you work in a traditional industry which sells time, but you're doing something innovative which probably isn't able to work in that model. How do you see that?
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. That's how I read that question as well. Our industry, at least where I've been working, is very time and materials based on a traditional approach. Like, you have a kind of outcome that you're going to achieve, and the resources that you require to get to that. But as you saw in the graph that I showed, with introducing new technology or new innovation, there is this sort of initial sunk cost, which you need to account for at some point in the investment. But also what we're trying to do, although we are doing things faster, that doesn't necessarily, if you stay on that time and materials business approach, it's essentially a race to the bottom of who can do each job faster. So what you have to be doing is to work out the value that your tools add. And maybe adding speed is not just that you do faster, it means you can check more options, you can test the solution space much further, you can do other things, or maybe there's other pieces of value that you add, that because you have this data source or this technology, you can introduce information that you wouldn't necessarily have at that stage of design. And so being able to quantify that value is really, it's a very difficult task, and value-based pricing is something that's being spoken about in the industry a lot. Everything from, the ICE's Project 13 about moving from output-based to outcome-based kind of procurement routes, which can allow a little bit more for these agile type design processes, which might help to account for, failure happening in the design approach. But because you can be more agile, rather than everyone just saying, I'm going to put this amount of hours in and this will deliver X, Y, Z. It's about saying, this is the outcome that we're trying to achieve, and actually we'll be quite agile about how we spread our resources, how we introduce tech, etc. And then there's a lot of pieces working about value-based pricing, and that's a very difficult thing to quantify in a lot of cases, and is sometimes dependent on the problem. So whether it's getting something faster, so you get some kind of cut of the potential gain, or you somehow quantify it against the existing systems to show what you're adding. But it's a very difficult task, and the industry needs some kind of joint approach on how to attempt tackling it.
I agree. Does anyone else want to jump in on that as well? Amy?
Yes, just to agree, and also to kind of emphasize that I think so that industry really needs to, yes, completely agree that, you know, to be able to value outcomes. And I think in a way that this kind of digital and data goes completely against it, because it's actually, it will make things more efficient. But at the moment, the industry really values the amount of time that the people spend. So, you know, it leads to the procurement, you know, you submit rates, daily rates. And then of course, in order to get more money, you put more time. But so like reducing time to spend, there isn't an incentive, that there isn't a financial incentive. And then I think that also relates to the internal kind of valuing system, you know, how within the company, how do you value people's work, the time, you know, the more time you spend on the project, you know, that is valued. But actually, you know, that shouldn't be the value. If there is an efficiency achieved by, you know, developing the technology, that should be valued.
It's a really good point. Would anyone else like to add?
Can I add something? Yeah. So I think what's really interesting as well on that is that I think often, I mean, a big challenge in the consultancy world is that, as far as I understand it, is that, you know, you do the project and then you no longer get paid for that once it's completed, but the value and the benefit, and that's when it starts, right? And so your sponsors should be tracking that. And I think what often we forget is we forget to give them a baked-in approach in which they can do that easily. We have to make a sponsor's life easily. I'm speaking from an entire self-serving, you know, guys, make my life now easily, right? So if it's baked into the development of the project that this is how we will measure benefit, I mean, this is how you can measure benefits very easily, I think. And then, you know, 6 months down the line, you can easily give a sponsor a call and say, right, how did I go? I think when it comes to pricing it already, it is very tricky though, because what that would mean is that, you know, like consultancies would only get paid after a while, after we can decide whether the outcome has actually happened. Now, I think there is a, you know, like introducing even a 6-month gap in your cash flow in any consultancy business is a huge challenge and risk. So it's something, you know, for you to think about and discuss with your financial teams.
But I would counter that by saying that is how software companies work. Software companies have to put in a lot of effort at the beginning, and they spend that money and they don't see the rewards until either they're getting large contracts through or a large number of people are subscribing to their services. So it does work for them. Is it that the boards of infrastructure firms or infrastructure consultancies are afraid to take that approach, do you think?
I don't know yet. I will find out.
Yuvraj.
I will find out.
If I can add something, that I mean, when you say software company succeeds in that approach, very few of them do. There's a lot of startup out there which actually starts, like Emily said, there's a lot of early adopters that never make it through to, you know, getting to the mass. So one of the things I think Gary and I previously discussed in a different conversation is we as consultancy try to fail early. That's quite important. So in order to, you know, to avoid you know, just wasting time and resources on ideas that, you know, we know don't deliver value, we try to make sure in some of the projects, that's what we've done. We try to make sure that we have these gates essentially where we have to pass them in order to go to the next step. So this involves like getting stakeholder buying, making sure we are still measuring the value we're trying to deliver. And if we're not, then we just, we minimize the cost of failure. We know there will be a cost of failure, but we try to minimize that cost. That's why I think failing early is quite an important thing, because that's how we start to balance that corporate business model where, the cost of innovation is being kept small, because we are not trying to deliver something that will go to production from day one. We just want to check the idea. If it doesn't work, we bin it. Let's move on to the next one. That's, I think, one approach that can work.
I would agree, but I've seen examples of where it's taken 6 months to get approval for a project. And even if 3 or 4 weeks down the line, you realize it's not going to deliver the value, you've signed up to deliver something, and the pressure comes down to deliver that, even if you feel it's going to be a failure. So there is a challenge. But let's move on. Yuvraj, I'll stay with you if that's all right. Technology in infrastructure is often seen as quite backwards. I've seen experiences of work with rail. There are elements of the railway which are 100 years old, and they're replacing them when they fail with elements that are 100 years old, because it's safer, easier to do that for them. Technologies can promise some really exciting jumps ahead with using virtual reality and drones. But the more advanced they are, potentially the more challenging they are. Should we focus on those big, sexy projects, or should we focus our energy on the kind of quick wins, which will increase the likelihood of success?
I think before joining consultancy, before working in infrastructure, I had a brief time in aerospace, working with Airbus briefly for just after my undergrad. And this is another industry that, although it sounds like very fancy airplanes, they're very slow in adopting technologies because they're very heavily regulated. But when you talk about technology adoption and should you adopt those fancy technologies, I would say the fancier the technology, the more expensive they are, and you do not want to jump the steps here. So that's why we talk about the data science value chain. Is when we talk about data science specifically, data science technologies, is you don't really need the fancy AI tool. There might you might just need to be able to see the data to have, for example, that is just building Power BI dashboards. That's a very simple example of using a technology, but which can be very powerful because you can see the data that you have. I work in another industry, which is agriculture, during my time in academia, and one analogy I have is if you're a farmer and you have cows, they give you milk, but you don't know how much milk you're getting. How do you run the business? So that's where taking the right step, following the steps, like you need to start visualizing the information that you have first, and then once you understand what are the information that you have, what is the quality of that information, is when you can start moving. Okay, let's start using these fancier technologies, and how we can build on top of that information, because especially in data, you cannot use any of the fancy technology if you do not have data, if you do not have good data as the foundation. So jumping the steps there, if you're trying to implement a fancy AI tool, will ultimately result in the because data at the source doesn't exist, for example.
The devil's advocate argument to that is it's sometimes harder to fund that. If you're a large firm, it's really nice to put up on your website these fantastic new technology, AI, machine learning, drones, and it shows you off as an innovative company. One could argue that the more you put up about that kind of stuff, the less innovative you actually are. But and building on what you said, would anyone else like to add to that before we move on?
I think what you were saying about the low-hanging fruit and the sort of big pies, you kind of need to tackle them both. Like you need a mix of both, and like there's risks on both sides. The risk of the low-hanging fruit is that it's done on a specific project and it never gets used again. So there needs to be a sort of built-in mindset that you're trying to build for something bigger, and a central knowledge base which allows you to reutilize that, or else you end up reinventing the wheel 5 times or even more times than that on specific projects, so that you can keep utilizing that, whereas the risk on the big project is that it doesn't work. But you also need that, I think, to really push the industry. But I think both is kind of a nice place to be.
It's really good. I'm going to move to another question, and Emily, I'll stay with you and then probably ask Amy as well. This one's come in from the chat about IP. So with regards to investment on digital tools, how do the intellectual property rights affect the development? And would you say this is one of the key hindrances to the development and collaboration of technology between companies and clients?
I think it's definitely a challenge, but rather than necessarily seeing it as a hindrance, it's actually quite a good point to flip that on its head and it to be a really good discussion point to have those deep conversations with your clients. Because for various projects that we've worked on, it's from at the start trying to understand what would they, developing a scope which outlines what bits of the IP would stay within the developing company if you're developing a software, for example, and which bits would stay with the client. And that creates a really good discussion point, and those conversations can be had, and clients are more open to it than you think. They don't want to take everything. There are some things they don't want, like 25 million lines of code. They want the bits that are important to them. And so that's a thing that you can co-develop with them throughout the whole process of a project. So it's definitely a challenge, no, not taking away from that, but it's also something that can be really good for that process.
I think that's really interesting. I think in our experiences, we don't often find that clients are necessarily mature enough to know what should be theirs and what shouldn't be. But that's going to be an ongoing discussion. Amy, do you have any thoughts on that? I kind of ask you particularly because of the data science team you set up internally, which may generate a different answer because you're working, well, the way I understood it, you're working internally for the company as opposed to working externally for clients.
Yes. Yes, no, that's a good point. I think firstly, I think externally, it is still a bit challenged because, for example, if you look at the standard terms that, on the legal side, the standard terms, probably in our industry, it's based on engineering or design or architecture or construction and so on. Most of the project IPs go to the client because it's the drawings and things like that. And it doesn't work with the tech because you do want to retain whatever you develop, and then you put so much into it. So then it becomes that nobody knows how to change the standard terms, and then so I think there is a very technical kind of barrier in the legal side. I think in terms of the internal side, yes. So internally, obviously, there isn't an IP issue, but I think there is also kind of the protectiveness of different teams. So and different individuals. So it's not the legal kind of barrier, but culturally that still kind of works as a barrier. How do you, I think there is a comment in the chat about the data sharing and trust and things like that. And that relates to that. And what exactly the parts that do you want to protect as your own and that you don't want to share, and what are the things that you actually benefit from sharing, and then that is not understood. I think the data, for example, doesn't have a lot of value in itself. Nowadays data, and I think there is a movement to make the data more free. So access to data is free, but what to do with it becomes kind of intellectual property. But still that kind of distinction and the legal protection around it, it's still quite new. So there is a skepticism about that and apprehension about sharing in general, I think.
It's a really good point. I was going to kind of link into the data. Gary, I'll let you answer this as well, but I'm going to pull it across to data sharing. So one of the panelists asked, as one of the attendees said, how could we increase data sharing across the industry? Do you think data sharing would benefit innovation? And I think we'd all agree that data sharing would increase innovation, but the challenges that I want to kind of present are that our clients, or those who collect the data, see value in the data, and withhold it because they want to get some money for it, which isn't always correct. As you say, there's not necessarily value in the data itself, it's the insights that come from it. So Gary, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. It's a bit like land banking, isn't it? I mean, you can use a piece of land in a city for like parking, and that's fine. It will give you a bit of money. But actually, if you build, well, probably these days you want to build houses in it. But if you back 2 years ago you wanted to build a big office block, isn't it? That would be much more lucrative. So it's a bit like that, like using your data actually to its maximum value, and essentially, I don't know if you remember a couple of I think it was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, there was an initiative from the Transport Systems Catapult that was around like a data exchange, trying to get organizations to put their data in that space, and in exchange they would and in exchange for putting their own bits in, they would have access to whatever else is in there. So so rather than getting paid for it, they would get the access to the other data sets. Now, it entirely depends on what else is in there. So there's a bit of a critical mass to be built up before it is any good. But I don't exactly know what happened to it. But I think it was an interesting idea. I think part of the challenge, actually, there is the whole GDPR challenge that, once like you don't want to be the one who sort of messed it up. And I think the truth is that all organizations have still yet to like to be 100% on it, yeah, I think that's a big thing that's holding it back.
It's a really good point, and I've seen some work with forward-facing video on the front of trains, and they were using that to look at vegetation that was overlying the tracks. But there was a big pushback. People were concerned that when that train pulled into a station, we'd capture the faces of all the people on the platform. So what do we do with that? So 50% of the project was then developed to create a face blurring tool to offset the risk of capturing people's information. And then they said, well, we're looking down into people's gardens as we drive past. So then the project went down that route. And it was a real challenge to actually try and deliver value with all these hindrances. I'll extend that question a little bit. One could argue that government, companies, and kind of industry groups are all key to encouraging data sharing, and we've seen some evidence of that, I'm sure, ourselves. Who do you think it sits with best to really encourage collaboration and data sharing? And I'll open that up to the floor, whoever would like to pick that up. Yuvraj, in your experiences with Amey Consulting and the clients you've worked with, have you seen any good practice or poor practice?
I mean, I see a push towards data sharing, but if I focus on the data science community, most of the big players out there, Google, Facebook, Amazon, they're all at the moment towards they're all going towards open sourcing the majority of the tools. So a lot of the research that they produce is open source. So a lot of the technologies that they develop, you can now start accessing them freely. But what we're starting to see now, as these technologies become more advanced, like for example, OpenCV by Tesla, they are starting to charge people money to access some of the AI, for example, which traditionally the community has been, we are all going towards open sharing, open sourcing all our code. But now it's as these technologies start to deliver value, we are starting to see, people wanting to make money because there's a lot of money that had gone into this research. That's my take on data science. I guess for data science, there's still a push for open sourcing the softwares that we use, the code that we use, but companies are now using platforms like Kaggle, for example, to share the data publicly. Not all of the data, but data they seem is safe enough for them to share, so that they allow the public to come and work together, collaborate together, and build solutions together. So this can be done either through open source platform, or sometimes we see innovation boot camp where companies just allow a certain group of people to have access to data bearing certain conditions, and then we collaborate together. So people from different industries coming together, different companies coming together, working towards in those innovations would come to work towards common goal.
Emily, you look like you wanted to add something.
Yeah, no, I think in the blue sky thinking is that hopefully at one point there will be centralized data sources and people can come together and do it. But I think in the short term, it's definitely going to be very client led. I think to set precedences and to be able to drive projects in that way, because they are the people that can set up frameworks, at least in the short term, in a way that allows for innovation, allows for failure, allows for tech to be explored on different projects, and to have the mindset that's open to doing that. There's a little bit of a top-up approach, bottom-up even approach, where people in consultancy or whoever, with people with data, can go to others to say, we have this, what can we do with it, to create offerings. But I think definitely in the short term, it's going to be quite client-heavy driven to make sure that it can be adopted.
I think that's the experiences that I've certainly seen as well. We've got time. I'm going to ask one last question, and we'll keep it nice and positive because it's a relatively negative topic. This is from the audience. Where should we look for an example of where data or technology has been adopted by a traditionally old-fashioned industry? So where's an example of success that we could focus on? It's a tricky one.
I think we have one now. Currently, due to COVID, forced situation, everyone is working remotely, and we had to adapt very quickly. But almost all industry had to adapt to Zoom calls, Teams, sharing through cloud platforms. So I think that's a positive of how if there is the push for it, we can adopt technology very quickly, and cloud technologies have been adopted very quickly in the last year with some consequences, but it has been mainly positives.
Can I be cheeky here? How is England? Look no further, okay? So essentially, I think two or 3 years ago, there was Davin Crowley-Sweet, the chief data officer of Highways England, said, right, this is how Highways England is going to do data. And on the back of that, now there is some very exciting developments. One of which is data as a service, where we're looking to make eventually all of Highways England's data available through the cloud, and there's some really good progress that's being made in terms of onboarding some data sets which are maybe not necessarily that easy to access otherwise. And also our data science projects, the ones that Yuvraj and myself have been working on in the past year. I think it'd be a stretch to already call them a success, because we haven't had the time yet to see the benefits. But in terms of outputs and outcomes, it's definitely a success in a past year.
Any final thoughts from Amy or Emily?
Yes, perhaps, not quite a direct answer to that question, but I think if you look at finance, it has been, long criticized that it's very old-fashioned, and it's even more gigantic than, the dominant players that are more gigantic than our industry. And it's been, criticized that the tech uptake was quite slow. But now, the fintech is like all over the place. And I think, I'm not an expert of fintech, but the way that I see it is that it's kind of happened outside of these institutions, of large organizations, because the large organizations are very slow to move, and it's connected to absolutely everything. So for them to move on, it's a huge cost and it takes time. But the people who had the financial skill set probably kind of teamed up with the tech sector, and then it created kind of fintech. And now the big players have to respond to it, because they are competitors. And I think it would be really good that if the same thing could happen. So, the kind of changing the big players is one thing, but perhaps, small players can play a part in driving the changes in the industry.
That's a good point, and we certainly don't really see that in infrastructure yet, but maybe that's the future. Emily, finally, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I was just going to say Netflix, or the entertainment industry, and Netflix being a good example of where they took technology of understanding data and what people were watching. I think the story is that they looked at who was the most common actor or actress and what type of film, and they sifted through a whole load of data, and they first started their first, that's how they started Netflix. And look at them now, and a lot of platforms and traditional TV haven't really caught up or changed to adapt to it. Would be my example.
It's a really good example. Brilliant. I think we're out of time, but thank you very much for everyone who's dialed in, and a big thank you to our panelists, Gary, Yuvraj, Amy, and Emily. And just a reminder that we've recorded this webinar and we will send the link out later in the day so that you can refer back to it or forward it on to your colleagues. And we'll also add the slides to the AC website. Finally, next month, join us in the London ACE Emerging Professionals for a webinar on vertical extensions and their ability to solve housing crisis. So can we just build on top of what we've got? That's on the 16th of February, and we will find it on the website for details. That's it. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eddie.